What is America's exit strategy from the war against Iran? This is a question everyone is waiting to have answered. 3 days ago, I wrote about this but did not upload it. Then the announcement came that the American president would address the nation. I thought perhaps the United States has a strategic move, a chess piece, to exit the battlefield. What I had written could have been wrong, but it turned out to be correct. The United States has no decisive move left to use on the battlefield to win the game. It is left with only one option: inflict damage, and then exit. Now the real question is, if the United States withdraws, who will supervise this system? Will a new system be created, or will the existing one simply be managed? There is a quiet shift that happens in every major conflict. It does not appear in headlines. It is not announced in speeches, and it is rarely acknowledged in real time. But once it begins, everything changes. The war stops being about winning and starts becoming about leaving. At first, this shift is almost invisible. The language remains the same. Officials still speak of strength. Military actions continue. But the intention behind those actions begins to change. They are no longer designed to achieve victory. They are designed to shape an exit. This is where the United States appears to be today in its confrontation with Iran. Not at the beginning of a decisive campaign, but at the edge of a realization that this is not a war that can be won in the traditional sense. For decades, American strategy has relied on a predictable model. Pressure creates leverage. Leverage creates negotiation. Negotiation produces outcome. This model has worked in environments where opponents are integrated into the global system, where economic dependence creates vulnerability, where political isolation creates pressure, where military imbalance creates deterrence. But Iran does not fully operate within that structure. It exists partially inside the system and partially outside it, and this partial detachment changes everything. Because when a state is not fully dependent on the system, it becomes more resistant to the tools designed to control that system. Sanctions hurt, but do not collapse it. Isolation limits, but does not eliminate it. Military pressure threatens, but does not deter it completely. So instead of producing compliance, pressure produces adaptation. Iran adjusts, it decentralizes, it absorbs, and over time it becomes more resilient. This resilience is not based on strength alone. It is based on structure. A structure that does not rely on a single point of failure. A structure that can continue functioning even under sustained pressure. This creates a fundamental problem for the United States, because its strategy is built on the assumption that pressure leads to change. But in this case, pressure leads to endurance. And endurance is difficult to defeat, because it does not require victory. It only requires survival. This is where the conflict begins to transform. What was once a strategic confrontation becomes a test of time. Time in geopolitics is not neutral. It favors the side that can wait longer, the side that can operate without immediate results, the side that can endure uncertainty. Iran has demonstrated this capacity. The United States, however, operates within a different framework. It is not just a military actor, it is a political system. And political systems have timelines, elections, public opinion, media cycles, economic pressures. These timelines compress decision-making. They create urgency. They demand visible outcomes. This creates an imbalance. One side can wait, the other must respond. And when one side is forced to respond repeatedly, it gradually loses strategic flexibility. This is where escalation becomes complicated, because escalation is not just about increasing pressure. It is about achieving results. If escalation does not produce results, it becomes symbolic. Symbolic actions can maintain perception for a time. They can create the appearance of control, but they do not resolve the underlying problem. And over time, the gap between perception and reality becomes visible. This is where the concept of face saving begins to emerge. Not as a matter of pride, but as a matter of system stability. Because in a global system, perception shapes behavior. Allies respond to signals of strength. Rivals respond to signals of weakness. So the United States must manage not just the conflict, but the perception of the conflict. It must demonstrate that it is still capable, that it is still in control, that it is still leading, even as its options become more limited. This creates a strategic tension. Escalate too much, and the conflict expands beyond control. Escalate too little, and the perception of weakness grows, so the response becomes calibrated, measured, controlled. Not to win, but to manage. This is the essence of an exit strategy. It is not a single decision. It is a process of gradually reducing exposure while maintaining influence. But this process depends on one critical factor, the stability of the system being left behind. Because if the system collapses after exit, then the exit is not strategic. It is reactive. So the United States faces a deeper challenge, not just how to leave, but how to leave without destabilizing the entire structure. And this structure is complex. It includes regional alliances, energy dependencies, security arrangements, economic networks. Each of these elements is interconnected. A disruption in one area spreads to others. This is why the conflict cannot be viewed in isolation. It is part of a larger system, a system that is already under pressure. Global power is shifting. New actors are emerging. Old assumptions are weakening, and within this shifting environment, the margin for error becomes smaller. This is where the role of other powers becomes significant. Russia, for example, is not directly controlling the conflict, but it is positioning itself within it, through diplomacy, through engagement, through presence. Its objective is not immediate resolution, but long-term influence. China operates differently. It avoids direct confrontation. It prefers indirect engagement, through economic relationships, through infrastructure, through strategic investments. But even this approach has limits, because economic systems require stability, and instability forces choices. At some point, neutrality becomes difficult to maintain. This is the position China is approaching. It must decide whether to remain a passive observer or become an active participant. And that decision carries risk, because stepping in means exposure to conflict, exposure to responsibility, exposure to consequences. Meanwhile, regional actors are adjusting their positions. Saudi Arabia is cautious. It avoids clear alignment. It maintains flexibility, because it understands that the system is not stable. And in unstable systems, commitment can become liability. Pakistan is becoming more relevant, not because of global dominance, but because of its position within the regional network. It connects multiple layers: security, geography, influence, and in fragmented systems, connectors become valuable. Afghanistan adds another dimension. It is unstable, difficult to manage, resistant to control. China's reliance on Pakistan in this area reflects a limitation. Indirect influence can only go so far, and Afghanistan has historically resisted external management. This creates additional uncertainty, because instability in one area can spread, and when multiple areas are unstable, the system becomes fragile. India also becomes part of this equation, not as a direct participant in the conflict, but as a strategic actor. Its interests intersect with regional dynamics, with China, with trade routes, with security concerns, so it cannot remain completely detached. This creates a multi-layered system, not a single conflict, but multiple overlapping tensions, each influencing the other. And within this system, the United States must define its exit. This is what makes the situation complex, because an exit is not just a withdrawal, it is a transition from one phase of the system to another. And transitions are inherently unstable. They require careful management. They require coordination. And most importantly, they require a clear understanding of what comes next. This brings us back to the central question. If the United States leaves, who takes responsibility for the system? Because power does not disappear. It shifts. And when it shifts, new structures emerge. Sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, but always with consequences. So the exit strategy is not just about ending a war, it is about navigating a transformation of power, a transformation of alliances, a transformation of the system itself. And this is why the situation feels uncertain, because uncertainty is not a side effect. It is the defining condition of transition. And right now, we are in that transition. And transitions have a pattern, not a predictable one, but a recognizable one. They begin quietly, they accelerate unevenly, and then at a certain point, they become impossible to ignore. What we are witnessing now is not simply a continuation of conflict. It is the early stage of a systemic reordering. Because when a dominant power begins to step back, even partially, it does not just reduce its presence, it changes the behavior of everyone else. Allies begin to question assumptions. Rivals begin to test boundaries. Neutral actors begin to reposition. And this is where the real movement begins. Not on the battlefield, but around it. The United States, despite its limitations in this conflict, still holds significant influence. But influence is not absolute. It depends on perception, coordination, and credibility. And credibility, once questioned, does not collapse instantly. It erodes, slowly, subtly. This is why the next phase of this situation will not be defined by a single event, not a major strike, not a declaration, not even a formal withdrawal. It will be defined by a series of small adjustments, each one on its own appearing insignificant, but together reshaping the structure. Consider the role of silence. In geopolitics, silence is rarely empty. It is often strategic. There are actors in this conflict who have not yet fully revealed their positions. They are watching, calculating, waiting, because timing determines leverage. And entering too early reduces flexibility. Entering too late reduces influence. So they remain in between. Two such actors, though not openly declared, are central to the current calculation. They have the capacity to shift the balance, not decisively, but meaningfully. If they choose to engage against Iran, the United States may achieve something important. Not victory, but narrative stability. It would allow for a transition that appears structured, an exit that appears coordinated, a repositioning that appears intentional. This is what is often misunderstood. In modern geopolitics, appearances are not superficial. They are functional. They shape expectations. They influence markets. They guide alliances. So even a limited involvement by additional actors could serve a purpose, not to end the conflict, but to redefine its meaning. But this scenario is not guaranteed, because these same actors may choose distance instead, and distance creates a different outcome. If they remain outside the conflict, the burden remains uneven. The United States continues to manage escalation. Iran continues to absorb and respond, and the system remains unresolved. In such a situation, instability does not explode. It spreads gradually across regions, across systems. Energy markets begin to react. Trade routes adjust. Security calculations shift. And over time, the cumulative effect becomes significant. This is where China faces its dilemma. For years, China has expanded its influence through economic integration. It has built connections rather than confrontations, dependencies rather than alliances. This approach has been effective because it avoids direct conflict, but it relies on one condition: relative stability. And stability is now uncertain. If instability continues, economic strategies become vulnerable, projects slow down, investments become risky, routes become unreliable, so China cannot remain entirely passive. But engagement carries risk, because stepping into a conflict-driven environment requires a different kind of power. Not economic, but strategic. And strategic engagement exposes weaknesses. This is why China's response remains cautious, measured, indirect. It encourages alignment without direct involvement. It supports structure without overt control. But this approach has limits. At some point, the system demands clarity. And when that moment comes, China will have to choose, not whether to act, but how. Russia, meanwhile, has already chosen. Its approach is more direct, more visible. It engages through diplomacy, through presence, through signaling. But Russia's capacity is different. It can influence, but it cannot fully stabilize, because stabilization requires scale, economic scale, institutional scale, network scale, and this is where the limitations of individual powers become clear. No single actor at this moment can fully replace the structure that is being weakened. So what emerges is not replacement, but overlap. Multiple powers operating simultaneously, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. This creates a hybrid system, not unified, not fragmented, but fluid. And fluid systems are difficult to control. They respond to pressure in unpredictable ways. This unpredictability is what defines the current phase. Now consider the regional dimension. Saudi Arabia continues to act cautiously. Its behavior reflects awareness, not uncertainty. It understands that alignment in a shifting system must be flexible. Too much commitment creates risk. Too little engagement creates isolation. So it balances, maintaining relationships across multiple directions. Pakistan's role becomes more pronounced here. It is not shaping the global system, but it is influencing the regional one. And in times of transition, regional influence becomes more valuable, because global powers cannot manage complexity alone. They require intermediaries. Pakistan functions as one of these intermediaries, particularly in relation to Afghanistan. Afghanistan remains a persistent variable, unstable, difficult, resistant. External powers have repeatedly attempted to manage it and repeatedly faced limitations. China's reliance on Pakistan in this context reflects strategic pragmatism, but it also reveals constraint, because indirect management is not the same as control, and without control, outcomes remain uncertain. India's position adds another layer. It is not directly engaged in the conflict, but it is structurally connected to its consequences. Its competition with China intersects with regional developments, so it observes carefully, adjusts quietly, prepares strategically. This creates a multi-directional environment, not a single line of conflict, but multiple intersecting lines, each influencing the other. This is what makes the system complex, because complexity reduces predictability, and reduced predictability increases risk. Now return to the original question. What is America's exit strategy? At this stage, the answer is no longer a clear plan. It is a balancing act between escalation and restraint, between presence and withdrawal, between control and adaptation. The United States is not exiting from a position of collapse, but neither is it exiting from a position of decisive success. It is exiting from a position of limitation, recognizing that the cost of continuation may exceed the value of persistence. So the strategy becomes indirect: inflict damage, maintain pressure, shape perception, then gradually reduce exposure. But this process does not end the conflict. It transforms it from a visible confrontation to a managed instability. And managed instability is difficult to sustain because it requires constant attention, constant adjustment, constant engagement. So the responsibility does not disappear. It shifts from direct control to indirect influence. And in that shift, new actors gain space, new alignments form, new structures emerge. This is the beginning of a new phase, not defined by a single power, but by interaction, by competition, by adaptation. And within this phase, the question of control remains unresolved because no actor fully possesses it. And when no one fully controls the system begins to define itself through outcomes rather than intentions, through reactions rather than strategies. This is the deeper transformation taking place, the movement from a controlled system to a negotiated one. And negotiated systems are inherently unstable. They require constant recalibration, constant negotiation, constant balance. So the war does not end. It evolves from a conflict of force to a contest of structure. And in that contest, the outcome is not determined quickly. It unfolds slowly through decisions that seem small but carry lasting impact. This is where we are now, not at the end of a war, but at the beginning of something less visible and more complex. A transition that will define not just this conflict, but the structure that follows it. In the end, wars rarely conclude with clarity. They do not arrive at a clean moment where one side stands victorious and the other disappears from the field. They fade from the center of attention and reappear as something more complex, more subtle, and often more difficult to control. The question we began with still remains: what is America's exit strategy from the war against Iran? But by now, the answer no longer feels like a single decision. It is not a plan written behind closed doors. It is not a dramatic move waiting to be revealed. It is a gradual recognition that the nature of the conflict has changed. The United States is not stepping back because it has achieved a decisive outcome. It is stepping back because the system in which that outcome was once possible no longer behaves the same way. And this is not unique to this moment. It is part of a broader pattern. Power over time encounters limits, not always through defeat, but through complexity. The more interconnected a system becomes, the harder it is to control. The more actors it contains, the more difficult it is to predict. The more interests it overlaps, the less likely it is to resolve cleanly. This is the environment the United States is navigating. So the exit strategy is not about ending the conflict. It is about repositioning within it. Inflict enough pressure to maintain leverage. Avoid escalation that creates uncontrollable consequences. Preserve credibility, and then reduce exposure. But even this is not a complete solution, because exiting a conflict does not remove responsibility. It redistributes it, and that redistribution creates uncertainty. Who takes the lead? Who sets the rules? Who absorbs the risk? China has capacity, but prefers caution. Russia has intent, but limited scale. Regional powers have proximity, but competing interests. So no single actor fully steps into the role. Instead, what emerges is something less defined, a shared space, not coordinated, not unified, but interconnected. And within that space, stability is no longer guaranteed. It must be managed, continuously, carefully. This is where the real challenge begins, because managing stability requires more than power. It requires alignment. And alignment is difficult in a system where interests diverge. So the future does not move toward resolution. It moves toward adjustment, small shifts, gradual realignments, quiet negotiations, each one altering the structure in subtle ways. And over time, these changes accumulate. They reshape alliances. They redefine influence. They create new centers of gravity. This is how geopolitical systems evolve, not through sudden transformation, but through layered change. And this layered change is what we are witnessing now. The United States is not simply exiting a war, it is transitioning into a different role within a changing system. From primary architect to one of several competing managers, from direct control to indirect influence. And this transition carries implications for allies, who must adjust their expectations, for rivals who must recalibrate their strategies, for neutral actors who must decide where they stand, because when a dominant power shifts position, everyone else is forced to respond. Some will move closer, some will move away, some will attempt to balance both, and in that movement, the structure continues to evolve. This is why the question of who will control the system remains unresolved, because control in the traditional sense may no longer be possible. Instead, what emerges is coordination, temporary, conditional, adaptive, a system not defined by one power, but by the interaction of many. And such systems are inherently unstable, not chaotic, but sensitive, sensitive to shocks, sensitive to miscalculations, sensitive to shifts in alignment. This is where risk becomes persistent, not as a sudden event, but as an ongoing condition. Economic pressure, resource competition, security uncertainty, each reinforcing the other. And within this environment, conflicts do not fully end. They transform. They move from direct confrontation to indirect competition, from visible warfare to structural tension. And these forms of conflict are more difficult to resolve because they do not have clear boundaries. They extend across regions, across systems, across time. So the real story is not about how the war ends. It is about how the system adapts. Because adaptation determines stability, and stability determines influence. Those who adapt effectively shape the system. Those who do not are shaped by it. This is the quiet reality behind the question we started with. America's exit strategy is not a final move. It is a transition, a movement from one phase of power to another. And within that transition, the outcome is not fixed. It is still unfolding through decisions that are not always visible, through alignments that are not always declared, through processes that are not always understood. So we return one last time to the central idea. This is not simply a war. It is a moment in a larger shift, a shift in how power is exercised, how influence is maintained, how systems are managed. And moments like this are rare because they reveal something deeper, not just what is happening, but how the war itself is changing. And right now, that change is already in motion.
The conflict is shifting from direct warfare to deeper structural tension, and that makes it far harder to resolve. These kinds of conflicts don't have clear borders. They stretch across regions, across systems, and even across time. So the real story isn't about how a war ends. It's about how the system adapts. Because adaptation shapes stability, and stability defines influence. Those who adapt effectively begin to shape the system itself, while those who don't are shaped by it. That's the quiet truth behind the question we started with. America's exit strategy isn't a final move, it's a transition, a shift from one phase of power to another. And within that shift, nothing is fully decided yet. The outcome is still unfolding through decisions we don't always see, alliances that aren't always announced, and processes that aren't always understood. So we come back to the central idea one last time. This isn't just a war. It's a moment within a much larger transformation, a shift in how power is used, how influence is sustained, and how global systems are managed. And moments like this are rare because they reveal something deeper beneath the surface.